Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with a defiant one who was the first to be targeted by Trump for vengeful prosecution before Comey and the others, who, in response to being continually asked, what can we do to stop Trump, has launched a movement today to help Americans push back against Trump's revenge. Joining us is Miles Taylor, a national security expert who works in Washington, D.C. He serves as the chief of staff for Kirstjen Nielsen's, the former secretary of the Department of Homeland Security under the first Trump administration, where he published an anonymous essay in the New York Times blowing the whistle on presidential misconduct. He later published the #1 national bestseller, A Warning, and revealed himself to be the author and launched a campaign of ex-officials to oppose Donald Trump's re-election. He has worked as an advisor in the George W. Bush administration, on Capitol Hill, and as a CNN contributor, and is a co-founder of multiple democracy reform groups. His latest book is Blowback, A Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump, and he is the co-founder of Defiance.org, a coalition of national security veterans, whistleblowers, and pro-democracy leaders pledging to protect those targeted unlawfully by presidential abuses of power. And also joining us is Maria McFarland Sanchez-Moreno, the CEO of Represent Us. She's an advocate, author, and lawyer with 2 decades of experience globally and within the U.S. on issues of corruption, authoritarianism, organized crime, and human rights. And Maria's held multiple senior positions at Human Rights Watch and served as executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance at the helm of a team running groundbreaking state and national campaigns. And she's also the founder of the Congressional Courage Campaign. Then, with Trump's Russia today behaving like Nazis as they target Ukrainian civilians while destroying their homes and cities in the name of fighting Nazis, we'll look into the history of why the Bolsheviks and the Jews were Hitler's main obsession and primary target, and how the scorched earth cruelty of the murderous invaders motivated the Soviet people to defeat Hitler, who they initially thought could not be worse than Stalin, but soon found out the hard way, with 26 million Russians killed. Joining us is Jochen Hellbeck, a distinguished professor of history at Rutgers University, specializing in modern Russia, the Soviet Union, and the history of World War II. He's the recipient of fellowships from the New York Public Library's Cullman Center, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Academy in Berlin, among others. And he is the acclaimed author of Stalingrad, the City That Defeated the Third Reich, Revolution on My Mind, Writing a Diary Under Stalin, and the online project Facing Stalingrad. His latest book is World Enemy #1, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews. And before we begin with our tax dollars paying for the bombing of innocents abroad and racist thuggery at home, as families are ripped apart and neighbors disappeared from our streets, shops, and schools, we find ourselves at a moral moment when America's better angels have to be mobilized against a cruel and corrupt regime enabled by political cowardice and judicial blindness. The only way to save our democracy from its current descent into fascism is a massive mobilization of people power against a plutocratic-funded 2026 Trump campaign of voter suppression and intimidation by masked government thugs. As Trump cowers the owners of the press and defunds public broadcasting, Background Briefing needs your support to keep providing a reality-based daily briefing that exposes the regime's malevolent machinations to protect and defend our constitutional rights and freedom of speech and assembly. We ask you to make a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at our foundation, publictruthmedia.org, and thank you for defending the home of the brave and the land of the free. And joining us now is Miles Taylor, a national security expert who works in Washington, D.C., who published an anonymous essay in the New York Times blowing the whistle on Trump's presidential misconduct in his first term. His latest book is Blowback, A Warning to Save Democracy from the Next Trump. And he's the co-founder of Defiance.org, a coalition of national security veterans, whistleblowers, and pro-democracy leaders pledging to protect those targeted unlawfully by presidential abuse of power, which is being launched today. Welcome to Background Briefing, Miles Taylor.
Ian, it's great to be with you, and I'm great to have my friend Maria McFarland Sanchez-Moreno with me, the CEO of Represent Us, who's one of the organizations that we will be backing as part of this effort, and always good to be on your program, my friend.
Well, I'd love to talk to Maria if she can stand by and join us, but let's begin with what you suggested here. And just as a reporter, I get so many questions all the time. What do we do? What do we do? And I take it you've been haunted by that as well.
That is the genesis of this whole thing. And as you and I have talked about before, Ian, in April, I was hit by this shock executive order out of the White House, the president announcing an investigation into me, which legal scholars and human rights leaders, including Maria here, had reached out to me and said, look, this is the first time in American history a president has used an executive order to target a known critic for First Amendment protected speech. It's never happened before in 249 years in American history. And I'll never forget Maria calling and saying to me, this is a human rights violation. This is what that is. And it also is an ominous sign that this administration will be systematizing human rights violations. And in the wake of that, Ian, I had a lot of people ask not just how they could help me and my family, but how they could help in general. That question kept coming up. What can I do? And I'll be honest with you, I grew very frustrated hearing that every single day from people, not frustrated with them, but frustrated that someone hadn't just gone and filled that gap to create a central place, a hub or a club that regularly reached out to people and said, look, here are different ways you can engage in fighting back against this lawlessness. And so in absence of something like that existing, the other week, I decided I would just build the foundation for it and hopefully bring in all sorts of folks and communities to participate, to make sure ordinary Americans have options to push back against the lawlessness, to counter the revenge machine out of the White House. And one of those incredible organizations that we will support is Represent Us. They're at represent.us, and we're very excited to be teamed with them.
So it's more than a normal election in next November, because Trump's only just starting to suppress the vote and use these crazy people he's put in charge of election protection, etc. They're going to be out here in a few days on November the 4th, monitoring the proposition out here to give the Democrats another 5 seats to match the gerrymandering in Texas. But we have to assume that given the likelihood that the Supreme Court will get rid of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which will mean we'll actually go back to Jim Crow in the South. There will be no black representatives in the House of Representatives. 12 Democratic seats will disappear before a vote is taken, and that will mean that the Democrats have got to work extra hard to win back the House. Mm-hmm. And on top of what I just suggested, with Trump, as he gets more desperate, I think he'll strike out more and be more autocratic. So that's the dynamic we're facing. So this is a heavy lift, isn't it? You've got to, or we've got to, or somebody's got to get all the Democrats out, all the independents, and all of the moderate Republicans.
Yeah, this is the biggest mobilization challenge politically of a generation, and then some. And fortunately, I think you've seen at least a large portion of the population respond to that call. I mean, the No King's Day protests on October 18th, of course, were the largest single-day peaceful protests in American history. That's a great start, but we are still not where we need to be. And as you note, rightfully, Ian, the institutions that we would expect to play a check are withering in the face of the executive power expansion that's happening at the behest of Donald Trump. Now, one of those institutions, the U.S. Congress, is somewhere that I have not completely given up hope. I think there are still opportunities to get members of Congress to push back. And I'll give you an example, and I want Maria to weigh in on this because they've also been focused on this, and it's one of the reasons defiance.org is going to be teaming with them. There are cracks in the edifice of Trump's support inside the GOP caucus, little cracks right now. And one of them you see with U.S. Senator Rand Paul, for example, who has been on a tirade the past few days about these tariffs, which he makes very clear are a tax on the American people. And the U.S. Constitution says the only institution in this country that can initiate proceedings to implement new taxes is the U.S. House of Representatives, not the White House, the U.S. House of Representatives. The president can't unilaterally apply a tax on Americans, and that's what's happening. Coffee is up 40%. And so to see Republicans like Kentucky Senator Rand Paul starting to go after the White House signals there might be an opportunity to fortify the spines of some people in Congress to get a working coalition to resist this administration's encroachments on congressional prerogatives. So, Maria, I mean, I would welcome your thoughts on that front, Ian, if you'll allow us.
Absolutely. Maria?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we're trying to make happen. Find that wedge that will allow us to change the dynamic, right? So that you don't have Congress just rubber stamping everything that the president does and giving up all of their powers. Congress is supposed to exert oversight of the executive. It's supposed to uphold the Constitution. It has a huge role to play here, and it simply abdicated it. And the way you move Congress is through their constituents. Right now, many members of Congress are afraid. This whole administration has been operating through intimidation and extortion. But members of Congress also need to be reelected. And so when constituents speak up, and this ties back to what Miles was saying about what can we do when constituents speak up, particularly in swing districts, particularly in places where margins were small, that can make a difference. And what we're trying to do at Represent Us with this new Congressional Courage campaign that we're launching pretty soon is engage constituents across the country in an effort to push their representatives to uphold the Constitution, to exert oversight of the executive branch. You know, ask Pam Bondi some tough questions about the DOJ. Ask them about these investigations going after Trump's critics. Do your jobs. And by the way, they could also start reforming the system and addressing some of the underlying problems that led many people to be unhappy with democracy and that kind of got us to this place. So there's a lot that can be done in Congress. People have a tremendous amount of power there. We need to exercise it in a targeted, focused way.
And Miles, talk about defiance.org, which is being launched today. You mentioned it's a club for courageous Americans designed to help people push back peacefully, lawfully, and defiantly against presidential abuse of power. You also mentioned that there is a declaration of defiance to be signed. So how do you get to sign the Declaration of Defiance? How do you get to join this club? And does this club also help people like yourself and others who are being targeted by Trump?
Well, look, folks can start by going to the website. So if they go to defiance.org, one of the first things they can do is join a whole host of Democratic and Republican officials, former members of Congress, former senior White House aides, in signing this Declaration of Defiance. And it's not just words. We're calling this a mutual aid pact. And we're calling it that for a reason. There have been other institutions in our society that have been attacked by the Trump administration, and attacked successfully because they didn't band together. Everyone remembers when the White House started to pick off the law firms one by one, issuing executive orders against them, basically intimidating them away from taking on cases against the administration. And you know what, Ian? It worked. It was wildly successful because at this point in the first Trump administration, 75% of the lawsuits taken against Donald Trump were led by the big law firms. At this point in the second Trump administration, it's only 15%, a paltry 15%. Why? Because one by one, these law firms were picked off, they didn't stand together, and now they're scared to stand up to the White House. And so people have seen that and realized that collective action is how you protect yourself against that. So I'll give you an example. Nonprofit groups around the country, more than 3,000 nonprofit groups have now joined something that's been dubbed NATO for Nonprofits. It's basically a pact that says an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. If the administration comes after one of these nonprofits lawlessly, investigating them for no reason, all the other nonprofits in the country are going to come to their defense. Help them with the lawsuit, help them with staffing, help them with the moral support that they need when you're in the crosshairs of the U.S. Department of Justice. We need the same thing, Ian, for individuals in this country. And that's one of the things that we're launching at defiance.org. We want people to sign this pledge to say, we're going to stand together when one of us is targeted as part of this retribution campaign. And that's not just the James Comeys and the John Boltons and the Miles Taylors or the Letitia Jameses. It's anyone who might stand in Trump's way and be targeted. He's targeted small business owners in the past. He's gone after leaders of small protest organizations. He's gone after opposition politicians and figures. And we need to be ready as a big community to stand up in their defense. Because if that community is not there, it is very tempting, Ian, for those targets to step back into the shadows and just hope it blows over, which makes it that much easier for him to attack other people. And I will confess to having considered that path myself. Most people in my life, most people, not just some, friends, family members, lawyers, after the order against me in April said, why don't you just lay low? Why don't you lay low and hope it blows over and that they move on to someone else so you can protect your family? And I considered that because I want to protect my family. But I realized that if you feed the alligator, he's not satiated. They come back to the boat, right? And they'll eat you in the end. And that's why it's very important for people to stand together, because it's easier to do so. The old saying goes, there's strength in numbers and courage is contagious. And you got to do that by knowing that there's a group ready to stand with you. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do with the organization. And look, people who sign up and become members, which costs nothing, they can throw in $1 or $1,000 a month. But once they become a member, we pool our funds and we go support these amazing organizations out there that are fighting back. Every single month, our members will get together, vote on what they want to support, and we'll fund those causes and give them action-oriented ways to get involved personally.
But one of Trump's tactics in suing people in his vengeance tour is, even if he doesn't have a case, and he certainly doesn't seem to have a case. He doesn't have a case against you. He doesn't have a case against Comey. He doesn't have a case against Letitia James. He may have a case against John Bolton. But the other part of his hateful behavior and cruelty is he wants to cause pain and financial pain. So is there any mechanism for funds to defend people who have been wrongly prosecuted?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're hoping to do. So one of the groups that we're also supporting at launch is an organization called Whistleblower Aid, which has created legal defense funds for targets of presidential revenge. I know them because they did the same thing for me when this happened. And I was very fortunate that we got the support we needed from folks all across the country to be able to hire the best lawyers in America to take on this case. Now I want to be able to do that for other people in the United States who are in the president's crosshairs. But, Ian, you point to something very important here, which is that to the administration, the process is the punishment. They don't care if they lose these cases because they know they can destroy people's lives just by putting them through the painful process of being investigated by the federal government. Being on that blacklist, I can attest personally, has destroyed my livelihood, my family's security, their sense of safety, and it's socially isolating. All of these things happen just by being in that first part of the process. I haven't even been charged with anything yet, but by being charged by the president verbally with treason, it's enough to upend your life. And I know Maria has seen this all around the world. I mean, this is not a novel tactic here in the United States. Autocrats throughout history have used the process as the punishment to be able to deter dissent.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the whole point of the DOJ prosecutions, the executive orders, even the work with the law firms and the universities, it's not to just target the people who are the subject of those investigations. It's to send a message to everybody else. And you see it over and over, right? People then are afraid to speak up. It costs too much. It's easier to not take a stand, to just use different words, right? Change your language. Don't talk to the person who is objectionable, and walk away. And that is how the autocrats win, even though they don't have widespread support. It's not that they're popular, it's just that they've managed to intimidate everybody, to sell them on the idea that they're all powerful and you have too much to lose.
Right, but in selling people on the idea of their power, there's a certain point that could be reached, and it may well be reached soon, where there's no turning back, where democracy goes and autocracy becomes entrenched. So how do you see us, Maria, on that pathway? Because I think we are in a post-constitutional crisis.
Yeah, so my background, I worked in international human rights for many years, and I grew up under a corrupt autocracy in Peru. My father was American, my mother Peruvian. And I think we are well into the process, right? The way autocracy happens, the way you lose democracy in the 21st century is not through a military coup, troops showing up at the presidential palace. It's through 1,000 cuts, right? Where you slowly erode the norms until they're gone. And people who are looking for red lines, for a moment where suddenly, oh, democracy is over, they're not going to find them. It's just going to disappear gradually. And you already have lost so much with basic principles of democracy, like the rule of law, which says, you should have due process. You should not be using justice for personal gain. Or the separation of powers, the principle of checks and balances, or even free and fair elections. All of these core principles of democracy are under constant assault right now. I do think that we are at serious risk of it becoming entrenched. At the same time, I think that this is not something easy for many people in the United States to understand, because it's new. People haven't experienced this here before. The US has enjoyed, to a significant extent, these principles, and it's hard for people to imagine that you won't have a free and fair election next time, that you won't be able to make a different choice. But the way things are set up behind the scenes, that may be exactly what we're dealing with.
So let me ask Miles about the launch today of defiance.org. You've got Robert De Niro doing a video, right, in which he says you can't just sit on your ass and wait for the insanity and the cruelty to pass. You got to stand up and fight. So give us a sense of what's happening today in terms of the launch of defiance.org.
Well, I'll tell you what. So I had a conversation with De Niro about all of this not long ago. And the guy said some version of this to me. He has spent his whole career playing tough guys that stand up against bullies. And that's been so many different roles that he's played. And I think he sees in Donald Trump a wannabe strongman. But here's the thing. When you go try to inhabit the mind of that type of character who sees themselves as a strongman, you realize that people who have those characteristics have deep weaknesses. They project the idea of a strong man because they know their shortcomings. In Trump's case, he knows that he's corrupt. He knows that he's a man unmoored from any first principles. He knows that he's disliked by a lot of the people that have worked for him in the past. And his deepest fear, his greatest insecurity, is being a loser. And I will tell you, that's from firsthand experience. The guy on any policy issue, the way that you could persuade him to go one direction and not another was to show him, if you choose choice A, Mr. President, you'll look like a winner. If you choose choice B, you'll look like a loser, because his biggest fear was exactly that. That type of insecure person in the White House results in things like we are seeing now, a systematized revenge campaign that makes Watergate look like a preschool exercise. This is serious, it's huge, it's sweeping, and we need to be able to mobilize a response that's equivalent to the persecution they are undertaking. Right now, this administration, people thought originally was implementing a whole of government strategy to get revenge against the political opposition and the president's enemies. But I would say that's wrong. They're implementing a whole of society strategy. They're trying to bring all of the institutions of our society to heel and to make them afraid. The only way you can respond to something like that is with a whole of society response. And so that's what we're trying to organize with defiance.org. We call it a club for courageous Americans because we want people to come into that club ready on a regular basis to take action to defend this country. And those actions are going to change all the time, Ian. And that's the point here, is that there isn't one organization. There just isn't one project that can fix all of this. The administration is doing what Steve Bannon always wanted Donald Trump to do, to flood the zone. And I'll never forget Stephen Miller telling me in his second floor West Wing office during the Trump administration, the first term, telling me that in a second term, it would be, quote, a shock and awe blitz against the American people. Okay, that's the language we used before bombing Iraq during the Iraq War in the early 2000s, a shock and awe blitz, because they wanted to flood the zone. And so Americans are feeling overwhelmed. That's not a byproduct. That's the strategy. They want them to feel overwhelmed so that they can couch them into submission. We're trying to counter that by giving people an array of different ways to push back on a regular basis so they can keep up with what this regime is doing and ultimately, hopefully, preserve the rule of law long enough for it to be restored once Donald Trump is gone.
And of course, the shadow president, Stephen Miller, has been trashing Robert De Niro lately. And of course, Trump referred to Meryl Streep as being overrated. So I'm not sure.
Well, that's why I got to tell you, Ian, that's why I'm delighted that Robert De Niro is headlining this launch with us, is because this guy's not afraid and he doesn't take this stuff sitting down. So
right.
He's got a spine of steel.
But in terms of your own experience of being there up close and personal with Trump in the first term in the Oval Office, so you got a sense of who he is, and he's clearly a very sick and dangerous man. How do you explain the paradox of his grandiosity with wanting to build this horrible monument to himself, which is destroying the White House and overwhelming the original building? At the same time, you have the frailty of his ego that requires constant flattery from his cabinet, which we've all seen in a ritual way that is truly sickening.
Well, Ian, when you think about Donald Trump's character, it's really contrary to how conservatives like me were brought up within the party to believe leaders should act. And I'm still a political conservative, by the way. I'm not a Republican, but I believe in the conservative movement and the cause that originally, folks like Ronald Reagan pursued of free minds and free markets and free people as an optimistic and hopeful vision for the GOP. Donald Trump has strapped plastic explosives on each of those pillars of the Republican Party, at least the Reagan Republican Party that I came up in. And he's not a conservative, and he doesn't govern like a conservative. And so that's why people like me have defected from the GOP to call this out. But it's worse than that. It's worse than him undermining the Republican Party's first principles. He's undermining American first principles. This is literally the man, remember, who said he would terminate parts of the Constitution. And now he wants to build monuments to himself. And this is another almost comical self-own, because if you look at the last 100 years of autocrats around the world, one of the sort of bizarre defining features is they go build statues to themselves. They build monuments to themselves. Americans won't soon forget seeing the statue of Saddam Hussein wrapped in rope and pulled down by Iraqis during that war. But it wasn't just Saddam Hussein. You would be hard-pressed to think of an autocrat in the 20th century who didn't build monuments to themselves. And you'd also be very hard-pressed to think of small d Democrats, people in liberal open societies who went and built monuments to themselves. So I think, if anything, this is probably one of the best symbols that the man is a wannabe dictator. But I want to ask Maria that too, because she's seen this in autocracies all around the world. That's one of those odd defining characteristics. They want to go build bronze statues with their faces on it.
Well, Maria, let's get a quick last word from you and then Miles. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that when you accumulate so much power, you concentrate so much power, it becomes about you and not about the people. And this is what we need to push back on. We need to wrest that power back and put it where it belongs, which is, you and me, ordinary folks. And again, the power is there. We need to exercise it. We need to do it in a focused way using the tools that are at our disposal, which include our representatives in Congress. So that's where we are leaning in. There's great work going on elsewhere in litigation and protection of whistleblowers, and Miles is pointing that out, and we're so grateful that he has included us in his new club for people who want to stand up to what's happening.
Well, thank you, Maria and Miles. The last couple of minutes here, just give us our marching orders.
Yeah, well, look, I hope that people will first and foremost, they'll go to defiance.org. This is not some secret special interest group. It's a no BS effort to go find the best organizations in the country pushing back against presidential revenge and to fund them and to get people personally engaged. So when they go to that site, they can sign the Declaration of Defiance, that mutual aid pact for Americans to have each other's backs as this revenge campaign ramps up. And then I hope people become members. And it's not about a money thing. We don't want there to be a barrier to entry for anyone. They can give $1 a month. They can give $1,000 a month, but then they're in that club. And together we vote on and choose the organizations that we want to support, that we want to fund, and that we want to devote our time to get behind. And that begins very, very soon. So folks can join that initial cohort right away by going to defiance.org. And then we'll be in touch with them soon about the first group of great organizations like Represent Us, like Maria's group, that we will be out there protecting and advancing with their mission. So I hope people will go sign up there today.
But just in closing, it seems to me that what the American people, and we're talking earlier about how we need everybody that's ever voted Democrat out, every independent out, and every moderate Republican out that's not a part of MAGA. It's a huge call to save this country and save its democracy. But the one thing, and I think your experiences illustrates this, the last thing you can do is give away your power by being afraid of these people. And Donald Trump is an embarrassment, a total clown. He's like the frightened little man in The Wizard of Oz. Once you pull back the curtain, the great and powerful Oz is this ridiculous, quivering man. And we know, you know, because you've seen it, what a small man he really is. So just a last word on not being afraid and being bold.
Yeah, well, I'll say this, Ian, and I'll go back to something I've said before. I of course had considered laying low after this executive order, and it's tough. When the most powerful man in the world is coming after you or the organization you work for, it's scary to speak up. And folks are worried, even in their own communities, about stating their political views because they're worried about crowdsourced attacks and people pushing back against them. But there is truth to that notion that there is strength in numbers. When you know there are other people standing alongside you, it gets easier and easier to go out there and to tell the truth. And we want to make that possible. That's the only way that we're going to be able to resist this as we get Democrats and Republicans and independents who don't want to see our country backslide into autocracy and who want to work together to fight back. So this is that opportunity for collective action. This is the opportunity to protect your fellow Americans. And it's the opportunity to get out there and make sure that we protect free speech in this country and that we show we will not accept a president who criminalizes criticism by treating any of his critics like mortal foes. That's not acceptable for any president, Democrat or Republican, to do. And this will be a starting point of an effort to push back against that.
Well, thank you, Miles Taylor, and also Maria McFarland Sanchez-Moreno. I appreciate you both joining us. And I've been speaking with Miles Taylor, a national security expert who works in Washington, D.C., who published an anonymous essay in the New York Times blowing the whistle on Trump's presidential misconduct in his first term. His latest book is Blowback, A Warning to Save Democracy for the Next Trump. And he is the co-founder of Defiance.org, a coalition of national security veterans, whistleblowers, and pro-democracy leaders pledging to protect those targeted unlawfully by presidential abuses of power, which is being launched today And we also spoke with Maria McFarland Sanchez-Moreno, the CEO of Represent Us. She's an advocate, author, and lawyer with 2 decades of experience globally and within the US on issues of corruption, authoritarianism, organized crime, and human rights. And she's held multiple senior positions at Human Rights Watch. And she's the founder of the Congressional Courage Campaign. We're going to take a brief station break and we're back looking into the history of why the Bolsheviks and Jews were Hitler's main obsession and primary target, and how the scorched earth cruelty of the murderous invaders motivated the Soviet people to defeat Hitler.
There's a great and a bloody fight round this whole world tonight. In the battle of bombs and shrapnel rain, Hitler told the world around he would tear our Union down. But our Union's gonna break them slavery chains. And our Union's gonna break them slavery chains. I walked up on a mountain in the middle of the sky, could see every farm and every town. I could see all the people in this whole wide world. That's a Union that'll tear the fascists down, down, down. That's a Union that'll tear the fascists down.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Jochen Hellbeck, who is a distinguished professor of history at Rutgers University, specializing in modern Russian and Soviet Union and the history of World War II. He's a recipient of fellowships from the New York Public Library Cullman Center, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Academy in Berlin, among others. And he's an acclaimed author of Stalingrad, the City That Defeated the Third Reich, Revolution on My Mind, Writing a Diary Under Stalin, and the online project Facing Stalingrad. And his latest book is World Enemy Number One, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jochen Hellbeck.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'm so glad to be on your show.
Well, thanks for joining us, Jochen. And you're from West Germany, but you're a student of Russian and Soviet history. And obviously, there's a war going on right next door in Ukraine. So it's back on the public consciousness. Obviously, you want to talk about your book and the history and the enormous sacrifices that the Soviet people made to defeat Nazi Germany. But at this point, do you see Putin in many ways, since you've done so much work on Stalin, is he a Stalinist? Or, I mean, he's rehabilitated Stalin and got rid of Memorial, the historical organization that documented Stalin's crimes against the Soviet people. Where would you place him in terms of Stalinism?
I'd rather see Putin as a traditional Russian autocrat. He is actually quite uneasy about many parts of the Soviet past. So he appropriates selective parts of the Soviet past for his purposes, all those parts that actually support his understanding of Russia as an imperial state. He is nominally critical of Stalin's terror, and actually he has never rehabilitated Stalin himself. I do think it is probably more fruitful to compare him to some of the Russian czars in his own ambition. But that is not to say that certain aspects of the Soviet past reverberate through present-day Russia, and we see that in the war against Ukraine, and that has a lot to do with, from the Russian perspective, kind of defending a memory of a Russian, or I should say Soviet, victory in World War II, and defending a history against all sorts of revisionisms in Eastern Europe. And I do believe that, in fact, these history wars in Eastern Europe that flared up over the last 30 years have a lot to do with the outbreak of war today.
So in terms of the 26 million of the Russian or the Soviet people that were sacrificed in World War II, the Russian casualties in Ukraine are nothing quite at that level, but they're pretty substantial, 1 million killed and wounded. How does that relate to, because I've spent some time in the Soviet Union, and you were always reminded by Russians about the 26 million. Where does that fit in? In other words, the notion of sacrifice, is that sort of an acceptable number? Because I don't know that Putin could argue that he's achieved very much.
Right. I I don't feel that the Second World War, or what they call the Great Patriotic War, that those sacrifices immediately feed into the current war. I mean, they do indirectly, but not exclusively. So the Russian government today is asking its citizens to remember all the sacrifices that all their ancestors have contributed. And that goes back to, Alexander Nevsky and the campaign against Napoleon, but it is also it's even the Chechen wars. And so there are these new pantheons of national glory. There's a cathedral of the Russian armed forces that was set up, I think, in 2017, and has on its mosaics. It has all sorts of battles going back in history, all those that I also named, that are used to direct Russian citizens, unquestionably toward the state and their duties toward the state. So that's the kind of history that is being taught or beat into people's heads. The Second World War is more complicated because the Second World War was a war that the Soviet Union fought largely in an alliance with the Western allies, and the Putin government is basically now looking very quizzically and questioning in a questioning way at that memory, and seeing fissures and suspicions that actually did exist at the time. So even when the Battle of Stalingrad was raging, all parties were kind of making contingent plans, and there was never this idea. It was never completely off the table, of a separate peace, and that was the big Soviet suspicion that the Western powers would pact with Hitler, and all those suspicions are coming back today to essentially, I think, sow more distrust in this whole idea of the West. So it is really an anti-Western propaganda, but it is directed from so many different sources,
Right.
including from the imperial past.
Well, Putin did acknowledge when he was in Alaska briefly at that useless summit that he had with Trump, he did acknowledge U.S. Aid during World War II, which was pretty substantial in terms of aircraft and tanks and trucks and jeeps and stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely.
Khrushchev always understood that, and he and Eisenhower got on very well. It was a great tragedy that the U-2 flight and the shooting down of Francis Gary Powers scuttled that possibility of an early end of the Cold War, which I
Mhm.
think was a real possibility, and that was scuttled by hawks on both sides.
Yes, yes, undoubtedly.
So let's talk about your book and the extent to which history is not focused on what Hitler was all about and what his rise was all about and what the focus of his brutal and horrific ambitions always were from day one, which was against Jews and Bolsheviks. And those two words were united in the mind of the early Nazis, and that was always their aim. So the initial outbreak of World War II, heading west and ending up capturing all of Europe except for the UK, how would you describe that? That was just a prelude. That really wasn't what Hitler was aiming for. He always wanted to go after the Bolsheviks and the Jews in the East.
Oh, absolutely. He was actually very open about that, just as he was about to conclude the pact with Stalin, or as his deputy, I mean, his foreign minister Ribbentrop was to conclude the pact with Stalin's foreign minister Molotov. Hitler not actually behind closed doors, but he told a League of Nations official that very openly that his ambition was always to strike against the USSR. And he said, if the West is too stupid to see that, well, so be it. Then I'll first strike out against the West, and with all my might, I will then defeat the Soviet Union. So he said that very openly in August 39. And the League of Nations commissioner at the time thought that this statement was just so outrageous and crazy that he didn't report it to his superiors, and he actually was reminded of it only in 1941. So Hitler's plans were open and clear. You can trace this all the way back to Mein Kampf, which he dictated in 1925, and earlier speeches. It's not just the speeches, it's policy. And what I was myself so surprised as I wrote the book was to see just how strongly and how consistently the Nazis used the theme of anti-communism, which they always coded as a anti-Semitic campaign. They always, from the very beginning, understood communism to be a Jewish idea, a Jewish conspiracy to bring down the world. And so when they said communist, they really meant Jew communist. And I think that's the conflation that often goes missing in Holocaust scholarship, which only looks at references to Jews when they are named as Jews. But the communist was coded as Jewish. And it is this political opponent, the communist opponent, that essentially was this world enemy number one in the Nazi imagination. It was the carrier of an ideology that was antithetical to the Nazi, folkish ideology of one people, one race. Communism preached internationalism. It recognized workers from different nations as brothers, and it basically dissolved the whole idea of the Nazi folk. It was Jewish for that reason. It was all the more monstrous in the Nazi imagination. And it came from Moscow, which conveniently was also the area that Hitler chose as the sort of future colonial ground for the Greater Germany. So certainly those colonial aims factored in as well. But the the political project to destroy Bolshevism, which was always imagined as Jewish Bolshevism, was front and center. It was what brought the Nazis to power. It was the fear of this enemy in the East that, had infiltrated Germany. The Nazis were suggesting, they basically said all German communists are being steered by Moscow. So the enemy is already within us. And that was the foil against which Nazi Germany really assumed its shape. And it only got worse as we got into the war. And in the course of the war and at the Eastern Front, all of these images just morphed into sort of outsized proportions. And this is where also, the lethality, the mass murders really had their ground.
Right. But given that the League of Nations official, that Hitler was openly explaining to him what the real ambition was, which was to conquer the Soviet Union, and that conquering the Western Europe was kind of a sideshow, not his real impulse. And his obsession was against both Bolsheviks and Jews, which are almost interchangeable in his sick mind. What I don't understand is why Stalin didn't understand this, because the excuses for Stalin is that he was trying to buy time with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But he purged his military. They weren't prepared. And when Hitler invaded, Stalin got drunk for a whole week. And 1 million Soviet troops were captured and turned into slave labor. I mean, that's what I don't understand. I mean, you've written a lot about Stalin. How do you explain that if the intelligence was out there, what Hitler's real ambitions were, how come Stalin didn't know this and didn't act upon it?
Well, he didn't clearly know because he was fed this information repeatedly, but he felt he was smarter than his informants, and so he thought all of that is actually disinformation coming from London, and his fear was that the British, who were fighting Hitler alone at the time, were trying to lure him into a war against Germany based on what he saw as disinformation. And you have to keep in mind that Britain historically was, as much of an enemy as Nazi Germany was the older enemy. It was, a leader of the Allied intervention. Winston Churchill had orchestrated the Allied intervention into Russia just 20 years earlier. And so Britain, Japan, and Germany were like three equally threatening imperial powers. And actually, Stalin had access to Mein Kampf, and he had read it much earlier than other statespeople. And even the Russian translation of Mein Kampf was the complete translation. Western translations were selective translations, so-called polite translations that took away some of the most monstrous parts of the Nazi ideology. So he did have all that information, but he just was off on his own timing. I mean, he did arm the Soviet Union ruthlessly for this showdown, and he did know, though, that they needed more time. And so he was desperate to avoid getting the Soviet Union drawn into the war prematurely. And he of course, got it all wrong.
Right, but he did purge a lot of the generals, did he not?
He had purged them earlier, yes, and that also weakened the Red Army significantly. I mean, he had purged Tukhachevsky, who was the proponent of deep operations, who essentially was like a Russian Guderian who actually knew a lot about deploying tanks as an offensive weapon and doing and joint operations through the infantry, tanks, and air force and going deep behind enemy lines, encircling the enemy, just as the Germans were going to show and do in 1941. But of course, he was executed, and his knowledge had been pulverized, and all of that had to be relearned painfully and slowly. And in fact, during the encirclement of the Germans in Stalingrad in fall winter 1942, the Soviets finally actually adapted those tactics, but it was a very, very costly lesson because in the first year of the war, the Red Army lost something like almost 6 million men. I mean, it's an incalculable number.
Right. And many were taken prisoner, of course, in the initial onslaught, and were
Yeah, those are included in the 6 million. So it's
right, and they were used as slave labor and
Mhm.
treated abominably. Um, but just in the last couple of minutes, though, what the book makes clear is that the brutality of the Germans against the Soviet people and against the Jews in the occupied territories that they captured backfired in a sense that the people were so outraged, Stalin aside and his incompetence, they fought that war because of the rage that they felt against what the German occupiers had done.
Exactly. And so for me, this is the sort of the main connector between the German invasion and the German racist ideology and its super deadly effects on the main nemesis, who was imagined as this Jewish Bolshevik other or enemy. This on the one hand, and the Soviet war effort. In between stood Stalin, who was deeply unpopular when the war broke out in 1941. And what is so interesting and paradoxical is actually the way in which the Germans, how they hoped to pulverize the Soviet system, to really eradicate it, how that pulverization actually led to a popular war against the Germans, because people on the ground very soon realized that this is a war directed against virtually all of them. And it was that immediate realization that catalyzed this enormous and sustained resistant effort. Not to say that many Red Army units actually fought desperately and really tenaciously from the very beginning, but I'm speaking now largely of the people who did not evacuate civilians, who remained because they thought, well, the Germans can't be so bad. They're certainly not worse than Stalin, because Stalin had brought just so much oppression to Soviet people. The famine in the grain growing regions in Ukraine and then the middle and lower Volga, they were, very recent memory. And so people, not necessarily that they believe the Germans would bring them salvation, but certainly they didn't expect them to be any worse. And so they stayed. And then it was the spectacular and massive violence inflicted by the Germans, those mass hangings where, they would leave the corpses dangling from balconies and lampposts for weeks as a deterrent. And their open humiliation of all the people in the East, who, at best they would just see them as retarded, as dumb, as sheep, as less than human, and at worst they would basically see them as vile enemies and shoot them on the spot. So that realization sank in quite quickly. Also, the realization that German propaganda about Hitler as a liberator was just all just propaganda, and that in fact the Germans were helping themselves to everything on the ground just for their own needs. This turnaround, it was not immediate, but it happened within a year or so. I document this quite closely in my book. Really meant that we are talking about sort of a Soviet people's war. I think, that was a popular propaganda slogan at the time, but it actually had a good amount of truth. And one way that made this possible was the work of propagandists on the Soviet side. And my chief conduit there is this wonderful Soviet Jewish Russian writer, Ilya Ehrenburg, who became the leading war reporter of the Soviet Union at the time, who also published in the New York Times to tell American readers what's going on in the Soviet Union. And he wrote these editorials on, every single day of the war. And every editorial is packed with documentation, with documents he found or that were delivered to him, showing what the Germans were thinking or doing. He was citing from German diaries and letters and military orders. And then using this documentation to make clear this is the type of enemy we're fighting, and that is why we're not letting up. So the way in which Ehrenburg and others not just incited, but prior to inciting, actually informed Soviet readers about what was going on is almost unparalleled. And so you can almost say that the Soviet readership at the time was better informed about many or most of the German horrors than readers elsewhere in the world.
including here in the United States, which
Yes.
had Germany not declared, or had Hitler not declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, it's doubtful whether the United States would have gone to war. And so that's one of the great ironies that
Mhm.
here in the United States there was quite a lot of support for Hitler. The New York Times was backpedaling what was happening, wasn't it, in terms of the Holocaust?
Oh, they were also, I mean, I wouldn't say adulating Hitler, but they showed enormous understanding of Hitler in their coverage in the 1930s. And my explanation for that is Hitler's anti-communism. I mean, it really resonated with U.S. anti-communism. They thought, he's a plebeian man who is uncouth and clownish at times, but he's doing important, necessary work. So that is, there's also this sense that he has a kind of futurist scenario. There's the future that's unfolding in front of our eyes. I mean, this incredible sense of possibility of how a single nation pulled itself out of this depression and marched into the future, set against a US that is deeply mired in the recession. So all of that, in some sense, is understandable, but it's also deeply unsettling. Especially when you sort of think about the present day and age in which we are also looking at, different authoritarian rulers in the world, and basically promising some kind of shiny unified future, and our democratic project is just falling apart meanwhile.
Right. Well, we could spend a lot of time talking about the analogies between Trump and Hitler, but it seems that in many ways the true picture that you were talking about that the Soviet people had was much more accurate than the ones that the American people had.
Well, it was accurate and inaccurate at the same time. I mean, for instance, the Jewish theme was a theme that was quite difficult to articulate, even for a Jewish activist like Ehrenberg. And actually, many of those war reporters were Jewish. Adding to the irony is that they were actually raised as secular Jews, and only the Nazi onslaught and what they then saw, what was happening to Soviet Jews, the beginning of the mass murder of Jews. It all took place first on Soviet territory. The anti, essentially what you can call the Holocaust. It all started on Soviet terrain, and Soviet observers, who were often Soviet Jewish observers, of course, took notice of that. But the difficulty in the Soviet Union was to talk about one uh, one one group of people alone, in isolation from others. And the Soviet mandate, the Soviet reason of state, was basically built on this idea of an unbreakable union of multiple ethnicities. And so even Ehrenberg had to be very careful whenever he spoke of Jewish suffering, that he would kind of package it into the suffering of non-Jewish Soviet people, such as Russians or Ukrainians or other people, and in the end, it led actually many to dissolve the Jewish particular fate into sort of this idea of the Soviet people who had suffered. Now, this is kind of a linguistic way of dissolving the suffering. It's not necessarily a lie because these were Soviet citizens, but it did not. There was this problem of articulating the Jewish particularity. And the one go around was that actually Aaron Book was able to talk about the suffering of Jews as Jews in publications that were not Russian, but Yiddish. There was a Yiddish newspaper, a state newspaper, in which he could publish in fall 1943 an article called Ukraine Without Jews. And it's fully centered on Jewish suffering and essentially the Jewish genocide in Soviet Ukraine, but it could be published only in a language that Russian readers didn't understand.
Well, your book, of course, has extraordinary number of photographs that support much of what you're describing here. And I thank you very much for joining us here today, Jochen Hellbeck.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Jochen Hellbeck, who's a distinguished professor of history at Rutgers University, specializing in modern Russian and Soviet Union, in modern Russia, the Soviet Union, and the history of World War II. He's the recipient of fellowships from the New York Public Library's Cullman Center, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Academy in Berlin, among others. And he is the acclaimed author of Stalingrad, The City That Defeated the Third Reich, Revolution on My Mind, Writing a Diary Under Stalin, and the online project Facing Stalingrad. And his latest book is World Enemy Number One, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Sasha Linden Cohen, and Asher Price. If you missed any of today's program or would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on those platforms. Find us on Twitter and Facebook, as well as also now on Blue Sky at Ian Masters Media. And please do help us reach more listeners by sharing the program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help us sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing, and I'm always available at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
The guy that lived next door in 305 took the kids to the park and disappeared by 9:30. Who'll ever know how much she loved them so? That dark night alone in America. A quiet voice singing something to me. An angel song about the home of the brave in this land here of the free. One time, one night in America. time when